Oh, apparently I can only do one at a time. Okay. Okay. So, I guess that means we're live now. It says excellent condition, but nothing. There it is. All right. So I've already done the introduction for my podcast for today. I'm about to move into the second piece. I did, of course, start over a few times because I got myself confused a few times. Really going to have to start. If you see me rub my eyes and stuff like that, it's just allergies. They're really attacking me bad today. Gonna really have to start promoting my blog again, or sorry, my podcast, because I'm not getting very many listeners anymore. Kind of a punch to the gut when that happens. All right, I think I'm ready for the next section. All right, so moving on to the 1816 United States presidential election, which of course is the 8th quadrennial presidential election. Just a little background into what is going on leading into this election. Of course, it was held from November 1st to December 4th of 1816. It ended up being between Democratic Republican James Monroe and Federalist Rufus King. This is the first election after the War of 1812. James Madison continued the tradition of those presidents serving more than one term to actually retire after serving 2 terms. Now, I've mentioned this in the previous podcast, but this tradition of retiring after serving 2 terms and not running for a third presidential term stays intact until we get to Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s when he actually runs and wins 4 terms. But what is going on in the background to this election? Again, the War of 1812 has ended. James Madison decides not to run for a third term. And the main person who actually does end up become president, James Monroe, is actually favored and has support from outgoing President James Madison and former President Thomas Jefferson. Now, that doesn't mean Monroe did not have competition within the Democratic-Republican caucus. Now, what's interesting during this time, we're going to start that over. I'm struggling way too much. Fortunately, I only waited about 2 minutes. So, in an effort to actually do better on this, I will stop a lot more, even though I do think this is going to be the shortest episode that I do of my presidential forecast. Oh, there it goes. I'm going to try better of stopping when I need to and just starting over instead of just trying to ramble through it. To me, maybe that's a big part of the listenership, if you will, going down. There was just way too much stumbling in that portion. And maybe today's just my allergies, so I may just have to suffer through it. My listeners will have to suffer through it, and of course, my live streamers will have to suffer through it. So let's start this again. Nope, I'm going to try that again. Shouldn't have deleted that first one, so I knew where to start. Okay. All right, so naturally, we're going to start with the 8th quadrennial presidential election that was held from November 1st through December 4th of 1816. This is the 8th quadrennial presidential election, and it will actually see James Monroe for the Democratic Republican Party go up against Rufus King of the Federalist Party. Now, history tells us that this is the last time the Federalist Party actually puts up a candidate, but that's not entirely true. We can actually, at this point, go back to 1808 when the Federalist Party actually put up their last candidate. Because if you remember from the last episode in 1812, there was no official Federalist candidate. It was actually a Democratic Republican candidate who ran on a kind of combined party ticket of Federalist and Democratic Republicans. And even this time around, with Rufus King running, he was never actually formally put in as the candidate for the Federalist Party. He was never formally nominated, is what I'm trying to say. So let's do a little background going into the 1816 election. We have President James Madison, who is ending the end of his second term, and he is going to actually carry on the tradition up to this point of choosing to retire after serving 2 terms instead of running for a 3rd term. This is something that is kept as a tradition until the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt. And it actually, because of what he did, he ran 4 times and won 4 times, dying shortly after starting his 4th term, that we actually had an amendment added to the Constitution that made the tradition of only being president for 2 terms federal law. So he is supported James Monroe is supported by outgoing President James Madison. He is also supported by former President Thomas Jefferson. And at the time, Monroe was the Secretary of State. The interesting thing here, even though he does have the support of 2 presidents, one outgoing, one former, he still does have competition within the Democratic Republican Party caucus. And the interesting thing about caucuses up to this point, they're not like the primaries that you and I think of today, where there's this long nomination process where votes start in January and go all the way, sometimes up until the convention. No. The caucus at this time is actually a congressional caucus. It takes place. So he does go up in the primary against, let's talked about how it's a caucus and called it a primary. My mistake. But he does actually go up in the caucus against William H. Crawford, who is the Secretary of War. Now, Crawford actually did not think he stood any chance of winning at all. So he actually did not campaign. And another reason he didn't campaign and didn't think he was going to win was because he was afraid that if he did run against James Monroe and lost, if he put in a serious effort, he would not actually get to serve under James Monroe when and if he became president. So he made a calculated call and chose not to actually campaign. You kind of get the impression that he probably should have, just because of how close the caucus was, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. So the official party ticket for the Democratic Republican Party was James Monroe for president and Daniel D. Tompkins for vice president. James Monroe, of course, was the currently serving Secretary of War. Daniel D. Tompkins was the governor of New York. And I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about Daniel D. Tompkins, even though he did serve 2 terms as vice president. There were 2 other men who ran, but decided that they really had no chance of defeating Monroe to become the presidential nominee, and that was Governor Simon Snyder of Pennsylvania, and of course Governor Daniel D. Tompkins. And those that declined to run were House Speaker Henry Clay from Kentucky and General Andrew Jackson, former president, from Tennessee. So that was the caucus. And in the caucus, James Monroe ended up winning with 65 votes to William Crawford's 54. Now, going back to what I just previously said, William H. Crawford did receive 54 votes in the caucus ballot, just 11 in a row. So you do have to kind of wonder what would have happened if he actually put in an effort to run, to try to beat Monroe. Would would any of Monroe's supporters have ended up backing him if he did? And then for the vice presidential ballot, it was between Daniel Tompkins and Simon Snyder, who both briefly just thought about the idea of running for governor or for president and decided against it. Tompkins won that easily with 85 votes to Simon Snyder's 30. Now, what's interesting about this is this does continue the Democratic Republican Party's tradition of having the person running for president essentially from Virginia and the person running for vice president either from New York or New England. So this is a long-standing tradition at this point with the Democratic Republican Party. There was some thought to try to get Tompkins to run for president as well, just to try to end that tradition, to end the stranglehold that Virginia essentially had on the presidency, or what was called the Virginia dynasty of presidents. And in fact, when you look at it, this may have brought about the end of the Democratic Republican Party, because when they start actually looking at other presidents, other people outside of Virginia, that's when the party starts to kind of fall apart. But I mean, you think about it, the first 5 presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and finishing up with James Monroe, all from Virginia. So let's go ahead and move on to the Federalist Party candidates real quick. Won't be much of a segment here because, again, they didn't formally nominate anyone. This was the last presidential election that a Federalist candidate would appear in. This is pretty much effectively the end of the Federalist Party. Rufus King does become the nominee for president from New York, and John Eager Howard, former senator from Maryland, becomes vice president. So we're about to move on to the Electoral College. And one interesting fact that happens during the Electoral College vote. All right, just waiting for that to process. Still not really satisfied right now with my pacing or my voice, but I've got allergies, so I have to fight through that. And of course, anyone watching this on YouTube or on my Facebook page, please give me any suggestions on what you think I can improve upon. I've tried the scripting thing, but I'll be perfectly honest, it takes me longer to script than it actually does to do my podcast. And on top of that, I still will tend to sometimes get off my script. The only thing I really notice with scripting it is it takes away a lot of the uhs and ums, but I don't know. I'm just thinking outside the box, or thinking out loud right now as this part finishes processing, which it just did. Let's see. All right, time to move on to the general election. And just a spoiler alert for those watching the video, something that's happened in the certification of the electoral votes, which has a weird connection to what we just saw this past January with the certification of the 2020 election. It has to do with whether or not a state should have its electoral votes counted. All right, now on to the Electoral College vote for president. And ladies and gentlemen, it was not even close. James Monroe ended up picking up 183 of the 217 delegates, with Rufus King bringing in only 34. I'm not sure why my source that I look at to get this information decided to drop the breakdown of how each state voted. So I kind of had to do it from a map. But just to square this away, Rufus King ended up getting all of Massachusetts' 22 electoral votes and all of Connecticut's 9 electoral votes and all of Delaware's 3 electoral votes. So that's it. That's all for him, 34th. In other words, 16% of the electoral college. For the rest, Monroe picked up all of New Hampshire's 8 delegates, all of Vermont's 8 delegates, all of New York's 9 delegates, all of Rhode Island's 4, all of New Jersey's 8, all of Pennsylvania's 8, 25. I looked ahead. All of Maryland's 8, all of Virginia's 25, all of Ohio's 3, 8, all of Indiana's 3, all of Kentucky's 12, all of Tennessee's 8, all of North Carolina's 15, all of South Carolina's 11, all of Georgia's 8, and all of Louisiana's 3. So, I mean, outside of running unopposed, this is the largest margin to this point outside of course, Washington. James Monroe picking up 84% of the electoral votes. It is interesting that it doesn't say that 4 electoral votes actually, or electoral voters, did not cast a vote. But so yeah, 183, or sorry, yeah, 183 out of 217 electoral votes. It's a complete washout. So we look at how each state ran their electors, which I do every episode. So those states where each elector was appointed by the state legislature was Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Indiana, Louisiana, Massachusetts, New York, South Carolina, and Vermont. Those states where each elector was chosen by the voters statewide were New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia. And those states where they divided into electoral districts with one elector chosen per district by the voters of that district were Kentucky, Maryland, and Tennessee. Now, the only I guess sore spot, the only real major thing that happened in this election was when the House and Senate met in joint session. John W. Taylor of New York objected to the counting of Indiana's votes. His argument was simply that Congress had acknowledged the statehood of Indiana in a joint resolution on December 11th. The problem comes in is that the last votes that were accepted were December 4th, a week before. So he claimed that at the time of the balloting, Indiana was still just a territory and not a state, and therefore their votes could not be counted. The counter argument to this was that the joint resolution just merely recognized that Indiana had already joined the Union by forming a state constitution and a government on June 29th. They're saying their statement basically that Indiana had become a state on June 29th. They also pointed out that both the House and Senate had seated members from Indiana who had been elected prior to the joint resolution, which means that if Indiana wasn't a state up until that point, it was unconstitutional to have those members in the Senate and House. Representative Samuel Ingham moved that the question be postponed indefinitely, which it was. It was agreed to almost unanimously. The Senate was brought back in to count the electoral votes from Indiana. And this does have actually a parallel in a way. It has a link, has a connection to what we just saw this past January when the Senate and the House went to certify the election of 2020. In every election, senators and House members can object to a certain state's electors not being counted for any multitude of reasons. In this particular case, this year, it was, well, here's the honest truth. I still don't know why they objected. They threw out a lot of reasons, none which really made any sense whatsoever. Um, they, I mean, for Arizona and Pennsylvania, I believe, their objection was that the states had actually made it easier to vote, and therefore it was unconstitutional. That was their argument. That was their argument. That the states had made it easier to vote, and therefore the votes were unconstitutional. Does it make any sense? No. But that was their argument. And again, if you remember, they did this right after an insurrection. So crazy things happen in Congress. Pretty much every election. This just goes to show that 2020 isn't the first time that there's been objections. The objection in 1816 actually had a little bit more merit because it was questioning when Indiana was actually made a state. So James Monroe elected overwhelmingly to be the next president of the United States in 1816. That finishes up the talk on the Electoral College. We're going to move on to the popular vote, which was looking at the information. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 19 or 20 states that voted. We didn't have as many states actually report their vote out. So we'll get to that right after this. Oh. You know, I do strive to do the best I can with every episode. I don't know. I personally think this information is interesting. This is what I live and breathe outside of education. I don't know. So we're just waiting for it to process. And then I'm actually going to take a break. So I'm actually going to split this episode into 2 different episodes, I guess, as far as live streaming. Because I will need, I don't know. Maybe I'll just do a blank stream. I don't know. We'll find out, won't we? Join me as we wander aimlessly around a podcast. All right, that is done. Okay, now on, maybe this won't be my shortest one. I'm already up to 20 minutes. But I do kind of feel like I'm meandering. I don't know. Again, let me know. Let me know. All right, and now on to the popular vote. Again, there's roughly 20 states that hold an election, but only 9 states actually report out any results at all. And just before I forget, in this election, there was a 16.9% turnout, which is down 23.5% from 1812. And I do just want to get this quick plug out about the 2020 election. It is being reported out now that it is estimated that 67% of the country voted in this year's election. Once I finish this part of this podcast, I'm actually going to look back because I think that is an all-time record for elections in the United States. And it may be a huge record. But we'll make sure that once I finish this particular segment on the 1816 election. So for the popular vote, The closest state where the margin was under 10% was in New Hampshire, which was won by Monroe, where he only won by 6.6%. He got a total of 15,225 votes to King's 13,338 votes, a margin of 1,800 or 1,887. Now, that isn't the smallest margin, but it is in votes, but it is in percentage. Now, what's interesting is that in Massachusetts, Delaware, and Connecticut, even though they show that they voted, uh, it only shows where Rufus King won the electoral votes, and that's Connecticut, Delaware, and Massachusetts, the only three states that he actually won. But we look at the states who actually reported out, and we have Kentucky, which cast all 1,864 of its votes to Monroe. We have Maryland, where Monroe received 5,994 votes to Rufus King's 4,502 votes, a margin of 14.2%, or 1,492 votes. Already talked about New Hampshire, so we move on to New Jersey, where Monroe received 5,441 votes to King's 54, a difference of 97.04%, or 5,387 votes. New York, all they did is report out the number of delegates, all 29, to Monroe. In North Carolina, Monroe received 9,549 votes to King's 158, or a difference of 96.74%, vote-wise 9,391. In Ohio, we have Monroe with 3,326 votes to King's, 593 votes, or a difference of 69.74%. Pennsylvania, which was, it was still double digit, but it was still, in quotes, close. Monroe picked up 25,749 votes to King's 17,597 votes, a difference of 18.65%. Rhode Island cast all 1,236 of its votes to Monroe. And then Virginia, shockingly, Monroe picked up 6,859 votes to King's 4, or a difference of 99.88%. And it was Maryland. I do apologize. I said in the last segment I wasn't sure where the 4 electoral votes were that weren't cast. 1 was in Delaware, 3 was in Maryland. So, even in the electoral vote, Monroe picked up 82.8%. Popular vote picked up 68.2% to King's 30.9%. So, that for a quick, nice, little, easy segment, that is the popular vote for the 1816 election. We're going to turn our sides onto the 1820 election, which again, Monroe won unopposed. So that segment is not going to be very long, but it is time for a break. And I apologize for my silence up there. Oh, okay. Never mind. Something major just happened in my. Okay. All right. So that is processed. Naming it. Placing it. And now this is where I do a little research into 1820 just to see what needs to be said, if anything. Um, Between November 1st to December 6th, taking place at the height of era of good feelings. So I need to look into that. Talk about what the era of good feelings was. Started after the War of 1812, saw the collapse of the Federalist Party. And it was also the last election of the first party system. Because in 1824, there was a split between Democratic Republicans, between the Jacksonian Democrats and opponents of it. But I'll touch on that today. Um, but it's more for the next one. Not really all I need to talk about is when it was. Okay. And see, this is where the information it just doesn't hold up because it clearly states that the Federalist Party had fielded a presidential candidate in each election since 1796, but that's not entirely true. There may have been someone running as a Federalist, but they had not been nominated by the Federalist Party. And interestingly enough, the Federalists did put up a vice presidential candidate, which makes absolutely no sense. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Panic of 1819, which was one of the very first widespread depressions in the United States. The disagreement about the extension of slavery into territories starting to gain strength. Hmm. Yeah, 1820 is the first election with Maine. So there are some things to talk about. Let's see. Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Missouri participated in their first presidential election. Missouri with controversy since it was not officially a state. So I need to talk about that. And this would be the last time that a new state actually got to participate in an election for 16 years. Huh. So there's more things to talk about what's leading up to the election than the actual election itself. Um, uh-huh. A ticklish problem. The counting raised a ticklish problem. That's cute. So there is more controversy during the end of the election, which kind of goes back to my point that 2020 is not the only time that we see this. Huh. Okay. That doesn't really answer the question. And I'm actually not going to talk about the popular vote at all since it was. No, I am going to talk about it. This is interesting. Huh. Because what's interesting is in Massachusetts, though there was no official candidate for the Federalist Party, they did receive 29,675 votes, which was 12,000 more than Monroe captured, but all the delegates were awarded to Monroe. Oh, okay. So there is no real explanation of why Monroe still captured all the electors, but it's assumed that the electors that were placed, even by the Federalists, voted for Monroe anyways because there was no Federalist candidate to vote for. Okay. All right. Now, I'll try to take a break on this and see what I can do to, because otherwise you're going to be staring at a blank screen. I don't need. So let's see how this works. Be right back. There we go. Okay. There it is. All right. All right. So we move on to the 1820 election, which is the ninth quadrennial president. Let's go ahead and stop that. If you can't say presidential right, you don't need it being on air. That's all I'm saying to that. My unofficial sponsor, Red Bull. Personally calm down, Michael. Personally recommend the watermelon edition, or the summer edition, red edition, whatever they want to call it. All right, let's try that again. So now it's time to move on to the 1820 presidential election, or the ninth quadrennial presidential election, which was held from Wednesday, November 1st to December 6th of 1820. This election is taking place during the height of the era of good feelings. And the era of good feelings it began shortly after the War of 1812 and continued until 1824. So it's at the height, but it's also towards the waning. And actually, the 1824 presidential election was, man, y'all, I'm struggling today. Starting again in 3, 2. And now it's time to move on to the 1820 presidential election, which is the ninth quadrennial presidential election, which was held from November 1st to December 6th. This is taking place towards the end of the era of good feelings, which started shortly after the end of the War of 1812 and ended in 1824 with the presidential election of Andrew Jackson. In 1824, the Democratic Republican Party was split between those supporting Jackson and those against Jackson, and this would actually lead to the second party system. Now, I'm not going to talk about it in this episode. I'll wait till the next episode to talk about the second party system in depth. But the second party system was where we see the formation of the Democratic Party after the Democratic Republican Party split, and the Whig Party, which, as we all know now, is what the Republican Party would eventually form out of. So in this election, James Monroe was running on his own. Y'all, I just don't have it today. This will be my fourth take. Fourth take, beginning in 3, 2, 1. Now we move on to the election of 1820, which was the ninth quadrennial presidential election, which was held from November 1st to December 6th. This does take place during the height of the era of good feelings, which started shortly after the War of 1812 and ended in the election of 1824 with the election of Andrew Jackson. And this is really the election of 1824 is where we see the Democratic Republican Party split. Those who are loyal, basically, or supporters of Andrew Jackson, form the new Democratic Party. Those against Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian democracy, or the Jacksonian era, form the Whig Party, which will eventually, of course, become the Republican Party. But I'll talk more about that because that's actually the start of the second party system. I'll talk more about that in the next episode. But right now we're moving back to the election of 1820, which saw James Monroe essentially run unopposed. The interesting thing about leading up to the election is that the Federalist Party, which was still around, but at this point they'd been almost completely limited to the northeastern part of the United States, they were able to nominate a vice presidential candidate, which doesn't matter who it was, but unable to nominate a presidential candidate. Now, a lot of things are going on during this time. We have the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which actually forms not only Missouri but the state of Maine out of Massachusetts. Massachusetts, going into this election, was entitled to 22 electoral votes in 1816, but in 1820 they only got 15, with the other 7 going to Maine. Or sorry, 9 going to Maine, 3 going to Missouri. A lot of switch ups because in this election, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Missouri, and Maine were all new states. This would also be it would be 16 more years before a new state would actually get to vote in the presidential election, which was 1836 with Arkansas and Michigan. Arkansas and Michigan are 2 what we call sister states because they came in at the same time. This was part of the Missouri Compromise, basically stating that if you are bringing in a slave state, Arkansas, you have to bring in a non-slave state, Michigan. And so in 1820, that's Missouri and Maine. So there really isn't a lot to talk about with this because James Monroe is the president, Tompkins is the vice president. No one went up against them in the caucus, in the congressional caucus. They won easily, obviously. Monroe would actually end up picking up 231 of the 235 electors. The numbers kind of switch, but he ended up officially picking up 231 electors out of the 235. So he won all but 4, picked up 80% in a popular vote. No candidate actually came in second with 16%. DeWitt Clinton, who was a Democratic Republican, picked up 1.75%. And actually, John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts picked up 1 electoral vote from a faithless elector who just couldn't find himself voting for Monroe. So, I mean, yeah, there's really not a lot to talk about in this. The main thing to discuss is in Massachusetts, where no candidate, the Federalist ticket, picked up 29,675 votes to Monroe's 17,619 votes. It's the only state that Monroe does not win with the electoral vote. And there is really no reason given why Monroe still picked up all of Massachusetts electoral votes. It is just assumed that those 15 members of the Electoral College from Massachusetts went ahead and voted for Monroe because he'd won by so much. He won overwhelmingly that voting for another candidate would have just been irrelevant. Now, the only real dispute comes with Missouri. And there's a lot of information on what was going on. But by the time that Congress was due to meet to count the electoral votes from the election, it still wasn't decided whether or not to count Missouri's votes or not count Missouri's votes because they had not officially become a state. So it was felt that if Congress counted Missouri's votes, that would count as recognition that Missouri was now a state. On the other hand, if Congress failed to count Missouri's vote, it would count as recognition that Missouri was not a state. But it was also known ahead of time that Monroe had won in a landslide, and that Missouri's vote would really make no difference in the final result. The Senate did pass a resolution in February stating that if a protest were made, there would be no consideration of the matter unless the vote of Missouri would change who would become president. Instead, the president of the Senate would announce a final tally twice, once with Missouri included and once with it excluded. So that's why we actually do have a difference in electoral votes. So technically, in the 1820 election, Monroe won 228 electoral votes, and he also won 231 electoral votes because a senator did object. I'm sorry, not a senator, but a representative, Missouri Representative Arthur Livermore. No, Arthur Livermore, a representative out of New Hampshire. Got to read before I say. So, Representative Arthur Livermore of New Hampshire objected to Missouri's votes being counted. He argued that since Missouri had not yet officially become a state, it had no right to cast any electoral votes. Representative John Floyd of Virginia argued that Missouri's votes must be counted. Chaos naturally ensued. Order was only restored with the counting of the vote as per the resolution and then adjournment of the day. So, again, 2 elections in a row, we have objections to the counting of votes. So there are 2 official counts for the electoral vote, one including Missouri, one not including Missouri, but it does not affect the outcome of the election. In total of the votes cast, even though there were 235 members of the Electoral College, only 232 actually voted, 3 were not counted, and Monroe won 231 of those, with the other vote going to John Quincy Adams. And that is pretty much it for the 1820 election. When you're unopposed, there's really not much to talk about. That's just the way it is. All right. So that is it for the 8th and 9th quadrennial elections. In our next episode, we're talking about the election of John Quincy Adams in 1824. And that's only going to be one episode. I'll go a lot more in depth into that because John Quincy Adams is only a one-term president. Because in the 11th quadrennial presidential election in 1828, Andrew Jackson actually does win election, defeating John Quincy Adams. So, and another reason that I'm going to spend a lot more time on the election of 1824 is that this is the real true first time that the Electoral College is not fully decided, where the person who wins the most votes doesn't win. Now, it happened once before, but that was under the old laws. This is happening under the new laws that was actually put into effect to eliminate the idea that someone could win the popular vote and not the Electoral College. As we all know now, it's happened 5 times since then, 1824 being the first of this. And 1824 is a real interesting election, so I will be spending all episode talking about that. Next up after this is my final thought, or thoughts. And I am really looking. I am looking forward to the next episode on 1824 because that is just a really interesting election. Because of just how weird it went. Because we have this case, and I misspoke a little bit on the podcast, where Andrew Jackson actually wins the popular vote, also wins the electoral vote, but he does not receive enough to become president. He needed, what was it? He needed 131 electoral votes to become president. He only received 99. So it did go to the House of Representatives, where John Quincy Adams ends up becoming president. But you also look, I mean, the amazing thing of this, just looking on the outside of the election, is that all four candidates who ran, who got votes, all were Democratic Republicans, but they all had different alliances. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay were both allied to the National Republican side. Andrew Jackson, of course, allied to his own Jacksonian side. And then William H. Crawford allied to the old Republican. So obviously, I'm going to have to look more into what all of those are. But it is an amazing thing that even without a fully recognized second political party, that there are essentially four factions of the Democratic Republican Party. And thus ends the Democratic Republican Party, and it forms into the new Democratic Party. Everything just disappeared on me. That was weird. All right, I think that's done processing. Yep. And I may have to go back and split that into two different segments. I don't generally like 10-minute sections. Oh, let's go ahead and do that while we're looking at it. See if there's a good spot. Monroe. So, I mean, yeah, there's really not a lot to talk about in this. Monroe still picked up all of Maine's electoral votes, Massachusetts, and there is really no reason given why Monroe still picked up all of Maine's electoral votes, Massachusetts electoral for Monroe. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, there's really not a lot to talk about in this. The main thing is this. There we go. Okay. A lot better split. So one reason I like doing my final thought kind of thing is because it is a chance for me just to kind of go completely off any kind of script, looking at anything, and just basically talking about how I'm feeling about today's political system, or just whatever, floats my boat. So we'll see where this goes. Wish me luck. And welcome back to today's final thought. And I've really been kind of going back and forth of what I really want to talk about for my final thought. So maybe more of a final thoughts kind of deal, because there is a lot going on. I do want to quickly go back to the candidacy of Sister Sarah. Sarah Huckabee Sanders running for governor of Arkansas. Because what's interesting in all of this is that she is a complete novice to politics. She's worked within the political field, but she's never been a true politician. She spent most of her time, facing the public as former President Trump's press secretary. And she was not really given a good grade as a press secretary. I often would tweet at her, asking her when she was actually going to do her job, because she did not like doing press time at all, or press briefings. And when she did, she spent more time kind of just yelling at people for daring asking her questions as the press. So she announced her candidacy in a video that was mostly about Trump and using fear tactics. And that's how she's going to win the state of Arkansas, become the next governor of Arkansas. She's not going to campaign on anything. I mean, she's a full week into this, and all she's talking about right now is being attacked. Well, of course you are, Sister Sarah. You're in the political limelight right now. That's what happens in politics. Those running for office are going to get attacked, and in Arkansas, it may work for you to play the victim and say, look at these people attacking me. Look at the New York Times attacking me. You spent, what, 3 years? Almost 4 years as the press secretary and didn't actually work as a press secretary. And you want to sit here and play victim over it? Your whole big announcement was about being loyal to Trump and striking fear. Some of the policies that you have talked about, that you've thrown your hat into, don't actually affect everyday Arkansans. They don't. I mean, I could respect you a lot more. And of course, I'm saying this as a former Arkansan. I would probably throw a lot more respect your way. I would still, if living in Arkansas, never vote for you. I would probably throw a lot more respect your way if you actually talked about what you wanted to do for Arkansas instead of trying to run for federal political office, which is what you're basing your campaign on. You're not running for governor of Arkansas. You're positioning yourself as a national candidate, and you're not. You know, what happens on a national, federal level, of course, affects people in the states, but not to the level that Sister Sarah is doing. And if she's got anybody that's close to being competent working for her right now, they've got to get her focused on Arkansas. You know, I believe the Arkansas election is in 2022. I want to check that before I can. Um, and I'm sorry for the silence on this as I'm gathering my thoughts and looking up something. Yeah, it's in 2022, so it's in 2 years' time. I mean, she announced incredibly early that she was running. Now, the current governor, Asa Hutchinson, who I'm also not a fan of, is term limited. So he won't be running. But so far, I believe Sister Sarah's the only one officially to announce. But it's expected that Leslie Rutledge, who is the current um, Attorney General of Arkansas, and Tim Griffin, who is the current Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas, it's believed they will run, but they've not announced. Here's the thing: whoever wins the Republican um, nomination for governor is going to be the next governor. I just happen to believe that it is going to be Sister Sarah. She's the big name right now. And so it's going to be incumbent on anyone running on the Republican side, if they even want to have a chance at her, is to focus on Arkansas politics. If they can focus on Arkansas politics and what they're planning on doing for the state of Arkansas as governor, they have a chance of beating her, because it will become very clear to voters that she's out of her depth, because she's going to keep focusing on Trump and fear tactics. That's all she's got. So we'll see. I'm just going to keep going and break as I need it. And then we have the still things coming out about the insurrection that happened on January 6th. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look more deeper and deeper and deeper into this, as we find out more and more information, we find out just how lucky we are that it failed. Because there was an absolute plan to destroy democracy that day. And there were people involved in all levels of government, from the Senate to the House to the office of the White House to the Capitol Police. I mean, it is all over the place. And this isn't conspiracy. This is actual information coming out. That the former chief of the Capitol Police, actually, I think it was him, but someone within the Capitol Police cut funding for that day. So that's one of the reasons why the Capitol Police seems so undermanned and so underprepared. They didn't have the funding for the day. And now we're to the point where Trump's impeachment trial is coming up in about 9 days. And all of his lawyers have now quit. Now, some are jumping to the conclusion, because I don't believe any of them have said why they're quitting. Some have jumped to the conclusion and said they know he's guilty and they can't defend him. I'm taking a little bit different of a tact on this. I think the reason they're quitting is because there's no need to defend him. I think that Trump has gotten the private support of enough Trumplican senators that without hearing any evidence, and they're supposed to be, impartial jurists in this, but they're not. But they've already assured Trump that they're going to vote to acquit him, that there's no reason to defend him. I mean, the justice system in this country, as we all know, has been corrupt for a long time. Judging white people less than judging blacks. That's just one example. But seeing it in full display, where we have senators who are actual lawyers saying that they're not even going to consider any evidence. And the senators who are trying to say that impeaching an officer, even though when they impeached him, he was still the president, but holding a trial and trying to convict him of that impeachment after he's left office is unconstitutional. And I'm sorry, Senator Rand Paul, but that's just not true. No matter how you read the Constitution, it's been done in the past. Officers of the federal government have been impeached after they left office and have been convicted after they left office. I personally think that this is the end of the Republican Party. I could be wrong. I said this in 2008, but I think, and I don't think it's because we're seeing a split between Trumplicans and standard bearer Republicans. I don't think there's a lot of standard bearer Republicans left in this party. But I believe what we're seeing, and why I'm saying this is the end of the Republican Party, and we'll find out starting in 2022, is that normal people are not going to want to vote for a party that was perfectly fine with an insurrection, that was perfectly fine with a bunch of white supremacists and Nazis taking over the capital of the United States and attempting to kill legislatures. At least I hope that's the case. If that isn't the case, and the Republican Party, what we think are the normal, sane thinking people in the Republican Party, we're perfectly fine with that, and will continue to vote for people who believe in QAnon and believe in all this conspiracy crap, then the United States is in a world of hurt. I don't think the insurrection on January 6th was the end of this. I think it was just the beginning. is the first salvo, if you will, the first battle. And I hope I'm wrong on this. I hope what my heart is wanting to tell me that we're about to see a split between Republicans and Trumplicans, and that it's going to effectively end the Republican Party on the national level. I hope that's the part that's true. I hope what my mind is telling me that no, this is just the beginning, that this is who the Republican Party is, or what the Republican Party is. I hope that's wrong. But we'll see. I'm going to break this real quick because I'm up to the 12-minute mark on this. One more thing I want to talk about in my final thoughts for today. So yeah, this is going on a lot longer than I thought it would. I've got one more thing to talk about, and that is pandemic education. Oh, my eyes. Y'all. And I'm not lying. I'm not lying when I say that I think we're in a world of hurt right now. If you aren't concerned or scared by what's going on, you need to get woke, basically. Still processing. That was a 12-minute section, so. It's a lot to think about. I think it's done. Yep, it's done. Before I can. Yeah, it's in 2022, so it's in 2 years' time. I mean, she announced the Attorney General of Arkansas and Tim Griffin. I'm just going to keep going and break as I need it. And then we have the step break as I need it. Okay. And then we have it's funny where I said and break as I need it, and that's where I'm going to actually break it. So yeah, there we go. January 6th. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look more deeper let that process, and then I'll begin my final segment of my final segment. And this one I'm just going to record as is. If I struggle, I struggle. That's done. Waiting for the next segment to be. There we go. Oh, wow. So it's kind of funny as I start my final segment on my final segment, my third final thought segment. I thought this might be the shortest episode I've done, and I'm already sitting at 48 minutes. So you never know what's going to happen when you're talking. But for this last piece, I've got to talk about education in the pandemic. Because I remember back last March when all of this started, when all school districts around the country started going virtual. And teachers got so much praise for being able to turn on a dime and basically reinvent the wheel of education to continue teaching our kids. And now here we are a year into this. We're coming up on in the school district I teach in. when we're scheduled to finally come back in person will be exactly a year from when we went to virtual in the first place. But we're coming up on a year, and now teachers are getting fully blamed for education and the pandemic not working. And I take exception to that because most of the people saying this don't actually know what's going on. Teachers do not want to be virtual. We want to be in person, but we know that we're not there yet. We know that it's not safe yet. And not all teachers agree with this. Some teachers say we should be in person regardless, which to me is dangerous thinking. Because it's not the kids we're worried about. Those of us who are saying that it's not safe yet, it's not the kids we're worried about being in this coming back in person. It's those teachers who are in those categories that are at most risk of catching COVID. But we are doing our best. We don't want to flunk students for not doing their work, but it takes a team effort. It can't just be the teachers teaching right now. Parents have got to help out. And when I say parents have got to help out, that doesn't mean waiting until you get the report card and seeing that your child has a D or even an F, and then yelling at the teacher because the teacher didn't tell you. Well, in most cases, we have tried to tell you. But when you don't respond to text messages or calls or group messages on different platforms, you only seem to care when the grades are posted. That's a disservice to your child. And I'm not putting all blame on parents. This is all over the board. The ones being most affected by all of this are the kids. But teachers cannot, and we will not, be expected to do everything. I mean, this is a really deep look into the problems of education in the 21st century. Teachers nowadays, without training, are not only expected to be the teachers, but in many cases be the parents, be the social workers, be the psychologist, be the counselor, be the nurse, and in some cases be the adult in that child's life. And teachers are hurting right now, ladies and gentlemen. We're hurting. I know that at the end of this school year, there's going to be a teacher shortage across this nation like we've never seen before because teachers are done. Some teachers are checked out. For me, I still wake up every morning ready to go, ready to teach. Because that's what I want to do. But it doesn't mean I'm not burnt out. My job is, as an educator, to teach. But I take on these other roles willingly because I know that's what our kids need. But you can't put all your hate and all your direction of where blame lies at the teachers. We're doing the best we can. Not only have we been expected to reinvent the wheel of teaching, we've been expected to reinvent the wheel every couple of weeks. Sometimes every week. And it's not the kids that are burning us out. I can't stress that enough. It is not our students that are burning us out. It is the adults that are burning us out. We're doing what we believe is best for our kids. We are still being observed in classes as if it's a normal year. I've said this before on this podcast. This is not a normal year. And And so when we do the best we can on a Zoom call to teach our kids, and then we're told this is what you did wrong, it's like, well, how do you know I did it wrong? You've never done this before either. And that's my whole point with observations. If this were a normal year where all teachers and even all coaches have come from a place where they've educated in a classroom, they know what to expect. They know what's going on. And if they don't see something going on, they can point it out. But when we're all doing virtual teaching for the first time in our history, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what that teacher has tried before and hasn't worked. What you're seeing in that classroom, what that teacher is doing with their students, that may be the only thing that they've tried in this entire school year that has worked to get their kids not only into the Zoom for class, but engaged. So this year is practically done. We've got to, at this point, move our mindset to next year, in my opinion. No, I'm not going to do that, obviously. I've still got to finish out this school year. But we got to do better next year, whatever next year brings. I personally think that next year we'll be back in person. I don't think it will be normal yet, but I think we'll be back in person. The teachers need help right now, not scorn. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching on the live stream, or thank you for watching the recorded stream. And as always, stay safe out there. Wear your mask in public. Stay 6 feet away, if at all possible. We're getting there, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good day. All right. That is it. That is it for my podcast. I'm going to end the live stream at this point. You don't really need to go through my process. Thank you for watching. As always, I welcome any comments. Make sure on Twitter that you click on subscribe at the bottom. There, it may actually be over here somewhere. And click on that bell to get notified when there's a new episode or I'm live. But for all that, have a good day. Bye.